I'm really pleased to be joined on Not the Andy Marr Show for the first time in a Zoom by Lowkey, who is incredibly prolific in his output on what's going on in Palestine and Israel. Thank you so much for having some time to come on, Lowkey. I'm surprised you're not too busy to spend 10 minutes.
No, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, look, what I want to talk to you about is the story of the Al-Ahli hospital bombing, which has seen the death of over 500 civilians, was the most shocking bombing of the war in Gaza at the moment, up to now. And I just want to go through what we're being told about it, and then I want to hear your views on it.
Regarding the hospital, we have done a thorough and quick investigation of the events. And based on our intelligence, various sources of intelligence, our conclusion is that this was in fact a rocket that was fired by another terrorist organization called the Islamic Jihad that misfired, exploded partially in the air, apparently, and then landed on or near the hospital. It was not an Israeli strike, and we did not strike in the area, and we categorically deny any claims by Hamas or anybody else that this was an Israeli strike.
So you say a thorough and quick investigation has been done. Intelligence says it was from Islamic Jihad. Will you provide evidence, the evidence that the IDF has seen?
Yes, it will be shared. We understand the sensitivity and the interest, and we understand how our enemies in Gaza and outside of it will try to leverage this event. So therefore, there will be intelligence shared by us, proof, both visual and audio. The audio part will be a conversation between different terrorists, one from the Hamas and perhaps one from another organization, where they themselves, unknowing that they're being listened to, acknowledge the fact that that appears to have been a misfire. And we're also going to release aerial footage of the area before and I think during the explosion.
Nothing is questionable because we've seen both the British and the American accept the fact it was 400% Israel didn't do it.
We saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
But can you tell us what your views are? Are there any evidence that you've uncovered?
So let's break it down from the history that we know of one of the actors involved in this question. Israel, not only in this campaign on Gaza, but historically has a history of two things: bombing hospitals, which is a direct contravention of the First and Fourth Geneva Convention, but also lying when it has carried out an operation which has bad PR. So whether it was the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, in which in the direct aftermath, Israel and its proxies around the world spread misinformation about how she died, whether it was the Great March of Return, when Palestinians were attempting to practice their right under UN Resolution 194, which is to return home from Gaza in 2018. Thousands were injured, shot purposely in the knees, leading them to be amputees. People like Razan Najjar, a medic, was killed. People like Yasser Murtaja, who had press written across his chest, was killed. Israel lied. It said these people were armed. They were not. Israel repeatedly smears the dead when it carries out operations which are difficult for PR. Now, let's look at the audio that Israel presented to the world. Well, experts have looked at it and found that the two voices were recorded on separate audio channels. Not only were they recorded on separate audio channels, when the engineering of the sound took place, effects were added. One can only conclude from that information that Israel has faked a phone call. It wasn't recorded on one channel, it was recorded on two. The sound on both channels were then purposely manipulated. Okay? The second point, forensic architectures, which is actually led by the Israeli academic Eyal Weizman and others, investigated the place where the missile fell. And what they found is actually the missile fell from the opposite direction of the cemetery. So Israel's argument that it has a conversation between two people in Gaza has been discredited. It clearly is a fabricated audio. Its argument that then therefore the missile came from the direction of the cemetery is also discredited, because investigations by organizations based here have found that it came from the opposite direction. But if you also look at the history of the actors involved here, Israel in this last period is believed to have dropped bombs on anywhere between 19 and 22 hospitals in Gaza and health facilities. In addition to that, Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza is administered by the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church have said in Jerusalem that they received warnings, and the hospital received warnings from the Israeli military to evacuate that hospital 3 consecutive days leading to the bombing of the hospital. On Saturday they received a warning. On Sunday they received a warning. On Monday they received a warning, and on Tuesday the hospital was bombed. All of that evidence would lead a person to conclude that Israel did it. You look at the history of what has happened. You even look at this specific campaign. Israel bombed a children's hospital in Gaza during this campaign with white phosphorus. A Durra hospital in Gaza was bombed by the Israelis with white phosphorus. This is simply part of the routine of Israel's industrial cruelty, which is necessary to sustain this unjust social arrangement with millions of Palestinians, to occupy Syria, to continue to antagonize Lebanon. Let's be clear. The Israeli military is one of the most cowardly institutions in the world. It is absolutely comfortable with bombing civilian targets from the sky, bombing places of worship from the sky. What it's not comfortable with, it's comfortable with bullying unarmed children and old ladies in Jerusalem. It's comfortable with bullying men in Al-Khalil, what they call Hebron, where it's illegal for Palestinians to have a knife. And teenage Israeli settlers walk around with M16s. Oh, the Israeli military is perfectly comfortable with that. But it's not comfortable with this concept of a ground invasion. It doesn't want to do the ground invasion because it knows that when that happens, it is walking into a terrain that these military personnel are simply not comfortable in. And think about it this way. Israel, traditionally, its military has about 160,000 personnel as part of it. Now it has drawn up 200,000 from the traditional economy. This will have economic repercussions, obviously. You have estimated 40,000 fighters from the particular resistance faction that it's talking about fighting in Gaza. You also have at least another 10 to 15 to 20,000 fighters from other factions in Gaza, who probably will fight alongside that faction if the Israelis enter. Ideally, for a ground invasion, for a military like Israel, they would want 10 of their personnel to every one individual from the resistance factions for a ground invasion. Israel will not have that. And that is why it has the US Delta Force with it, which Joe Biden and the White House clumsily revealed just a day or two ago. When Biden was in occupied Palestine, what he refers to as Israel, he stated, or I don't believe that he is cognizant enough to actually construct a coherent sentence, But the caption, which was attributed to the White House and to Biden, was, "I was happy to meet our US first responders and congratulate them on the great work they are doing against Hamas." And who were the people he was embracing in the picture? They were from US Delta Force. Delta Force is a secretive special operations branch of the US military. It was essential to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It specializes in the breaking up of quote-unquote terrorist cells and specific assassinations of individuals like that of Qasem Soleimani. The US is a direct participant in Israel's war against a non-state actor, and Israel's war against this non-state actor largely consists of collective punishment of a refugee population in a concentration camp of 2.3 million people. Britain is now a direct participant also. It has sent a spy plane over the top of Palestine to assist in Israeli airstrikes. The US have sent 2,000 Marines and warships there. What this is about doing is trying to secure Israel's back for the case of a ground invasion, which actually Israel does not want to carry out. In the case of a ground invasion, what you have is you have numerous flanks which will be left weaker because of it. You have the West Bank, which has been a real center of resistance. And part of that explains why this operation was carried out when it was, because Israel was so deeply involved in the West Bank. And then you also have southern Lebanon, which is a front that Israel does not want to open up. And according to reports, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed yesterday on the border of South Lebanon. And what you also have, and this is another factor which has not been touched upon at all in any of the analysis that I've seen thus far. For the past year or so, Israel's military and intelligence establishment has been attempting to overthrow its government. Now, I'm not saying that lightly. David Benayer, the head of Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad, said publicly that he had given permission to the thousands of employees of Mossad to participate in the demonstrations against the government, as long as they didn't state who they were employed by. So what does that sound like to you? What you also had was Ben-Gvir come out and say, the United States needs to know that Israel is no longer a star on the US flag. We are an independent country. Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, came out and said, the US State Department is seeking to overthrow this government. Now, in this particular case, we are talking about one of the main organizations that has been pushing to overthrow Netanyahu, actually has been funded for the last 3 years by the US State Department. What you also had was the leak from US intelligence several months ago that found, according to the signals intelligence, meaning the monitoring of phone calls of people within Mossad, they found that actually Mossad were encouraging demonstrations against the Netanyahu government. Now, what has happened with this is Netanyahu has formed a war government. And who does that war government include? It includes Benny Gantz and key figures from Israel's military establishment. So the objectives of Israel's intelligence and military establishment in their moving against Netanyahu were achieved during this period. They are now in government. Ben-Gvir, though he still has the weight to distribute weapons to settlers in the West Bank, he is sidelined. Smotrich, he is sidelined. So what you have now is the Israeli military in the position that it has been jockeying to be in across this period with this war. But it was that vulnerability and that internal contradiction which opened up the space for the type of operation that we saw. But what is the next phase? The next phase is economic paralysis. When you look at 2021 and Ma'arakat Sayf al-Quds, the Unity Intifada, as it's known, you saw in one day 60,000 Palestinian construction workers go on strike just for one day. It cost Israel tens of millions of dollars, just that one day. You saw 300 trips on public transport cancelled because Palestinian public transport workers within Israel went on strike. 50% of the pharmacists in Israel are Palestinian. Something like 20% of the doctors are Palestinian. They've been moved out of the agricultural sector purposely, but they are still in the service sector, for example. In 2021, you had Palestinians pull out of the Israeli military because there are a small number of Palestinians in the Israeli military. This is not sustainable for Israel. It cannot survive. This unjust social arrangement cannot survive at this level of intensity. The shekel fell in 2021. It's falling now. When you disable the airport from functioning, Ben Gurion as it's known, then what you do is you severely weaken that country's ability to keep pumping through. And just last point on this question of hospitals, Ehud Barak, who's one of the key movers against Netanyahu across this period, has said publicly in the last few days that Israel must destroy Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. We must destroy Al-Shifa. What is he basing that imperative on? We do not know. But what is absolutely clear is that Israel has a history, not just recent, but more long-term, of targeting Palestinian health facilities. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a small part of a much bigger picture that definitely is illustrative to the way in which Israel's routine of violence goes.
Just to ask about the propaganda war.
Yeah,
on there.
I got you.
Does it prove that things have changed? That Israel's scared of the world's opinion of itself? Because why would they bother to deny it in such a pretty candid way? But anyway, why would they bother to deny it? Normally, they wouldn't bother, would they?
Well, I think it's partly due to the ferocious response of people publicly. Political allies were even in a knee-jerk, instinctive way condemning it. You're right, to some extent. Israel bombed the one of the oldest churches in the world the next day in Gaza, killing 325 Christians, Palestinian Christians, were sheltering there who have been displaced by what Israel is attempting to do. Israel is attempting a second Nakba. It wants to drive millions of Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai Desert in Egypt. It will fail. It will fail in this objective. But what it is relying upon is extreme forms of shocking and shocking violence. It will create the spectacle of violence and then use that to cause fear in people. But to get to your exact question about why would it bother, I'm not so sure about the internal motivations of what the Israelis do. Some of it seems very sensitive to public opinion, and some of it seems not to be sensitive to public opinion. One could ask, why would they lie about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh? I think part of the reason they lie is it comes down to a rollout in terms of psychological warfare that the British police do here. If we remember the killing of Jean de Menezes, the Brazilian man killed on the train in 2005, we look at the killing of Mark Duggan. Both of those cases had a huge amount of misinformation published immediately after the killing. The argument about John Charles de Menezes was that he had run, that he had a weapon maybe, and that they were defending people. Of course, none of that was true. He didn't run. He didn't break through the barriers. He just walked onto the train. They jumped on the train and they killed him. In the case of Mark Duggan, it was the idea that he'd shot at the police. He hadn't. In the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, it was the case that no, she'd been shot by. And what they do is they try to throw it into the long grass, muddy the waters, confuse people's perceptions to enough of an extent as to avoid scrutiny. But obviously, eventually, the truth does come out. And I'll never forget the day that the Israeli military eventually apologized for killing Shireen Abu Akleh. They killed 30 Palestinians on the very same day that they apologized eventually for killing her, over a year after the killing had happened. And even the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh in and of itself is a small part of Israel's wider war against journalism, which is it extends to many different things. You have to remember that even people within Israeli society have been arrested for posts on social media recently. You've had over 100 people arrested in that way. You've had Palestinians, thousands of Palestinians arrested for posts on social media for the crime of quote unquote incitement. The same thing I was accused of with my song, Long Live Palestine. I mean, can you believe that we have just had Greta Thunberg, okay, an autistic teenager, be told that the inclusion of a soft toy octopus in a picture that supports Palestine is anti-Semitism? And it was so bad that she actually removed the picture. We have to realize here, as people that supported the Corbyn movement, is that we were had on an industrial scale, and we were fools. And that, functionally speaking, the movement that we went to bat for became a weapon against us and a tool of the Israeli embassy. That's what has happened to us here. And we have to not let go of this clarity. This can't be a moment of clarity. This needs to be a movement of clarity. And, Kamal Nasser, one of the non-combatant political figures that Israel has killed and assassinated across the years, he said, we are planting seeds for which we will not see the harvest of. But we know that the young people will take up after us. And it has to be the same for us. They tell us resistance is futile. We say no, resistance is fertile. And even if we are planting seeds for trees that we will not sit in the shade of, we will plant those seeds.